Hey, Dynasty Warriors Origins is the most approachable game in the Warriors franchise in the last 25 years. I want to talk about it. Earlier this year, Dynasty Warriors Origins came out. It came out in the way that games in the Warriors series always do, where I heard nothing about it until 3 days beforehand, and suddenly I was incredibly excited for it. Between you and me, I've also been looking for an excuse to talk about the Warriors games a bit, so the timing couldn't have been better. For the uninitiated, Dynasty Warriors is a franchise of tactical hack-and-slash games centered around the tale of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a dramatized telling of the fall of the Han Dynasty from ancient China. It's actually a spin-off of a PS1 fighting game called Dynasty Warriors, which in turn is a spin-off of a grand strategy game fittingly called Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The series has had dozens of installments and spin-offs itself over the last 25 years, to the point that I'd have to make a whole other video just to go over them. I'd love to do a more deep dive on Samurai Warriors down the road, because I really do have a lot of appreciation for that series, but I figured for now there's enough in Origins to really focus in on in and of itself. But if you'd like to see something about Samurai Warriors, sound off in the comments below. Though I was raised on the Samurai Warriors franchise specifically, I've been a longtime fan of Warriors games in general. I don't really have the same nostalgia for Dynasty Warriors that I do for Samurai Warriors, but I like checking it out now and then. When I found out Origins was a complete reboot of the franchise, my interest was piqued. And after playing dozens of hours, I can honestly say this is probably the best game for new players to try to get into the Dynasty Warriors series, and Warriors games in general. And I know what you're probably thinking, it's the latest game, of course it's the best one to get into, it's new, it's gotta be good, right? So that's part of it, but I want to dig into how those new parts of the game largely feel designed specifically in service to making the franchise approachable to new players, and not just it being a good Warriors game. Because I say this as a fan, the Warriors games are really hard to get into. I mean, come on, already Dynasty Warriors is a series built off a fighting game, built off a grand strategy game, which is in turn inspired by a 700-year-old Eastern literary epic. Even just the premise alone is pretty intimidating for a new player. But I'm talking more on a design level. There's a lot of basic user experience problems these games have inherited over the years that many fans have adapted to, but makes it very difficult for new players to get into if you don't have someone walking you through it. The hardest part of being a fan of these games is trying to get people to see past all those flaws and understand why it might be fun or have potential. The struggle is real. With all this in mind, I wanted to dig into some of these conscious design choices and really interrogate some of the thought behind them, because I think it all works pretty well. I think it's obvious that Origins intentionally frames itself explicitly for new players. For one thing, it's in the name. It's not Dynasty Warriors 10 or Warriors Super Dynasty DS Edition or whatever. It's Origins, aka, hey dude, just play this one first. It's like the start of things, check it out. Traditionally, Warriors games have been very focused on wide-scale events. Large battles, conflicts between factions, shaping of nations are kind of core themes and focuses of the narrative. Again, this makes sense when you remember that it's also a focus of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and the strategy game Dynasty Warriors is literally spun off from, so it's fine. There are subplots and moments to explore characters more in depth, but by and large you're there to experience the ups and downs of major moments like nations being formed and rebellions rising up, stuff like that. And I think in a lot of respects that basic premise of Warriors titles is kind of what makes or breaks these games. I mentioned earlier how dense the premise of play as a faction in ancient China and fight historical battles during the Three Kingdoms era is a lot for somebody, especially from a Western country, to really engage with and understand. And I don't say that to sound smart, just frankly I wouldn't have known anything about Romance of the Three Kingdoms had I not played Dynasty Warriors when I was younger. It was just never culturally relevant for me, and that's fine. But getting somebody new to engage with that is kind of like asking a casual player to sit down and play a game based on I don't know, the War of the Roses or something. Odds are it'll be a lot of information for people who are not familiar with it to take in at once. I also think that this is why licensed Warriors franchises like One Piece Warriors and Hyrule Warriors are often received pretty well, because people who enter it are already familiar with the premise, so processing what the hell's going on narratively is much easier to do. What I think is really clever about Origins is how they chose to recontextualize the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and just present it through the lens of one blank character. A lot of Dynasty Warriors' plot is usually experienced by large battles with maybe a few cutscenes sprinkled in between to kind of establish some context. While that's fine for people who have already kind of understood the narrative or know the events, it can really alienate people who don't know the story or characters or any of the events that unfold. I mean, even when I was playing Samurai Warriors growing up, most of my knowledge of the Sengoku era was sort of inferred and patched together piecemeal by just context clues and what people were saying, but it was really hard to do. But from a player perspective, reframing everything through one character's experiences is super helpful to understanding a complex story like this one. Suddenly things like timelines, flow of narrative, character motivations, it all makes much more sense when you're directly placing the character in front of them and having them experience it firsthand. Makes the game feel a lot more like a JRPG with some tactical battles within it, as opposed to a more chaotic hodgepodge of events and battles that follow a timeline. And in Origins, it's a surprisingly powerful tool that lets you see how time affects the movements and feelings of a certain faction, but also gives room for more intimate character moments to play out. It finds a nice balance. Even on a gameplay level, narrowing this selection of fighting styles and gradually trickling them out is a great stand-in to introducing a ton of new playable characters. In previous games, you'd often be presented with a lot of characters right off the bat, with each, unique fighting styles to learn and adapt, but keeping only a handful of them and gradually trickling them into one character is a great way to keep gameplay predictable but with some depth. Origins also incorporates like an overworld view where you run around between battles as your character, and this is actually really helpful for building an understanding of spatial context and where in the world certain events took place. It's really helpful for understanding the source material better than a series of interconnected cutscenes would do. And I think foundationally, this whole reframing of the narrative does a lot of really heavy lifting in onboarding players to the core premise of the game right out the gate. Always hesitant to talk about subjects like game feel because I recognize that they often lean towards personal preference and tend to be very subjective. And in my experience, feel is often weaponized as a vague sort of design language cover-up for I just don't really like this. But honestly, I think most Warriors fans wouldn't even deny that a lot of Warriors games don't really feel great to play. I mean, yeah, okay, they're cool looking, they're pretty flashy and anime-esque, they have nice effects, it's always a spectacle just to see a bunch of dudes flying across the screen, that part's great. But even as a lifelong fan, I've always felt they lacked weight, punch. Characters will often jump with a certain floatiness, the haptic feedback can be a mess sometimes, the camera feels like such an underutilized component of the games, and even in some games, the special attacks don't really even have that punch that they feel like they're trying to give. I mean, this isn't really even a new thing either, it's an issue that has sort of plagued these games I think all the way back to the old Dynasty Warriors 2 days. I think a lot of the time the Warriors games just sort of feel trapped in the PS2 era with regards to how they feel. And also, I've always felt this was a question of production more than anything else. Dynasty Warriors games released at a rate of about one game every few years, and in between that were always additions to other franchises, stuff like Hyrule Warriors and Samurai Warriors, One Piece Warriors, and all the other various spin-offs that filled in the gaps. There's always a new game getting churned out somewhere at some point in time. There's a concept in development called tech debt, which is where inevitably shortcuts need to be taken to reduce production times on games, but then long-term they start to cause technical issues down the road. When making games at such a rate, a lot of pressure is typically to work fast as possible while spending as little as possible and make as much content as possible. In these sort of environments, it can be really hard to find the resources and bandwidth to dig in and refocus on things that might foundationally need an update. Things that are really foundational, like cameras, character controllers, and physics, this stuff often requires things like engine reworks and design time to really get right. I've always sort of suspected that the Warriors games were just kind of bogged down in a lot of technical debt over the years. And I think new players were often pretty critical of this component of the games too. But my god, in this respect, by moving to a new engine and rebuilding everything at the expense of features like co-op, I think Origins really brings the feel back to it. There's a ton of really smart little details in this game that are vast improvements to feel, so I'll try to burn through them. The camera never cuts away and seamlessly transitions when you're executing specials, and even doubles down on the close-ups, which really helps specials feel more impactful. The camera now just shakes on successful hits. The camera follows with a catch-up delay when moving to make movement feel more dynamic. The camera now automatically tracks back over the character's shoulder instead of relying on the player to snap it back into place by hitting the block button. They have built-in time dilation now that slows gameplay and adds impact frames to weighty moments like a successful dodge and knocking out an officer. Vertically adapted music now adds a punch to climactic moments. While still being an input-driven controller, character animations now blend together instead of just snapping rigidly. I totally recognize that this might seem like a lot of really small things, but this is the difference between this and this. Like, everything from moving around the world to fighting lots of bad guys has a real weighty and punchy nature to it now. It feels a lot more grounded, which is just something that the series always felt very lacking. And I think it's changes like this that make it able to stand more on its own two legs as a game that is just built to modern standards and player expectations. As a result, Origins is a game where knocking out dudes can fundamentally feel good every single time for a long time, rather than just maybe for the first couple hours. But to be honest, while this stuff is really good and definitely what new players are kind of looking for, I think the biggest heavy hitter is just a lot of the basic user experience improvements that they've added to the formula. So, user experience design, or UX design, is kind of what it sounds like. Design that takes into account a user's experience when interacting with a product. UX designers think about games in terms of actual player experience, asking questions like, what would a new player think about X? And kind of adapting the design to it. A lot of it is building tutorials and teaching basic understanding of the game and the foundations of what you're doing within it. I think this is the big one that Origins does right. A lot of design changes in Origins feel tailored specifically for making it easier for new players to understand and engage with the information being presented. My impression has always been that the majority of fans of Warriors games are recurring players. They've usually played another game in the franchise or a different Warriors title, and they're just kind of picking up the latest one to check it out and see what they've added or changed. This is a good thing and a bad thing. It's good that these games have a dedicated fan base who are always willing to see what's new and different. I think the bad thing is that the games don't really have to change much to keep onboarding new people. They're not really looking for those new players. I'm also of the opinion that the UX is probably the weakest element of most mainstream Warriors titles. I think between the very early Warriors games and even up to the PS4 generation, a lot of very foundational parts of the UX never really changed all that much. Only in recent years does it feel like Omega Force has started to take notice of that and kind of take action on it. And Origins finally feels like a culmination of those efforts, where they addressed almost every piece of UX criticism I have ever had about the Warriors series. Okay, the biggest problem Warriors games have had for new players can be boiled down to one thing: information overload. These games have a reputation for being this mindless hack and slash arcade fest, but I know anybody who's played them for a length of time knows that there is kind of a big tactical layer to the whole thing. If you're not paying attention to what's happening in the battle, it's possible to lose an objective or even the entire scenario outright. That's why it's important, like in any game, to keep the player informed of their goal and objectives and to keep them updated as these change. Because losing an objective can mean suddenly losing the entire battle. And the Warriors games do this in multiple ways. Every battle has an overview screen presented to you beforehand that shows you win conditions, lose conditions, prep screens, unit locations, and other important additional context. During gameplay, there's also character dialogue and battle logs that pop up, which give you the narrative of the battle, keep you updated on these changes as they occur, unit statuses, warnings, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of information they're presenting at a given time. But more information doesn't implicitly mean clear information, and a lot of this can get easily overwhelming for people who have never played these games before. While experienced players might be able to keep up with it, a new player is expected to take in all this information alongside learning the game's controls, dueling against a tough officer, trying to figure out which base to capture, and so on. I'd argue that historically most Warriors games just fail to deliver information in a concise and effective way. I think they tend to really pack it in at an unreasonable rate, and most players can't really keep up with it, so they kind of get turned away pretty easily. But I think that's why Origins really addresses a lot of these sort of UX issues, because they know that it's a problem. Take for example the pre-battle screen. So it maintains this overview screen, but with an effective twist. It has a character talk you through what's going to happen, including the flow of the battle, any potential surprises, and ideal outcomes. Now, instead of just being shown a map of the battle and hoping that you figure it out on your own when you get there, players are kind of guided through it in advance, which goes a long way in informing expectations. These UX changes are noticed in battle as well. The battle log, for example, was always a component of the Warriors games, but Sometimes key messages would flash by in a moment, and if your eyes weren't used to darting around the screen looking for information, they could be easy to miss. You could be fighting someone and not notice that an objective has changed completely. Now in Origins, by default the action pauses, the minimap grows to show you the action, and the critical message is displayed prominently on screen, front and center for a few moments, just to make sure you don't miss something very important. What a massive improvement that is. Now players who might be caught in the heat of battle can pause and identify when something big is going down and get ready to adapt to it. Honestly, even something as simple as English localization goes a long way in this respect. I know saying localization is simple is hilarious, but just bear with me. Games in the Warriors series aren't always localized to English, but the fact of the matter is that because of the overwhelming amount of information being presented, playing these games without dubbing makes this information overload even more apparent. You thought just fighting 100 dudes was hard enough? Now try doing it while characters yell at you in Japanese and you're trying to read the subtitles flying by on the bottom of the screen while also playing the game. I'm sure including English in Origins wasn't just in service of reaching more fans, but also a conscious UX choice, because it ensures new players could just listen to the dialogue rather than having to read it in the heat of battle.
You are a vassal of Lord Gongsun. We shall lend you a hand.
Who are you? Never mind. You have my thanks. The enemy officer has been defeated.
There's also amazing UX feedback in the on-screen visuals. Like they added these icons representing current officers who are in conflict, as well as how their struggle is going. It's great because these icons were never even in previous games, so a lot of the battle flow was left up to you reading the message flow, looking at the minimap, and just a bunch of guesswork. Maybe you could pause the action and see exactly how much health an ally had, but largely figuring out where to focus your attention was a lot of effort on the player's part. Now they just tell you with these things, and even give chimes and flashes to pull your focus to them when new conflicts arise. What a good solution. Another thing that adds to the visual complexity in these games is that it can be hard to hone in on where an enemy officer is among the wave of health bars and movement that comes along with having a huge number of people on screen. And this problem could have been so much worse in Origins, where the number of enemies on screen is honestly way bigger than ever, and more things are just fighting for your attention. They combat this visual density in a few different ways. During moments of importance during a large battle, they'll wrest the camera from your control, pause the action, and explicitly frame objectives so you have no reason to not miss them. On top of that, when a strong enemy is approaching, they give them a huge hologram warning type thingy to call attention to their position, so you can seek out officers and kind of act accordingly around them. Enemy attacks are also telegraphed prominently with both visuals and audio in order to give the player more time to react to their movements and figure out parries. It can still be overwhelming during large battles, but a lot of this UX work is really serving to at least make this constant rush of combat and information more digestible. I think this does a huge amount of work in lifting the burden of entry new players have. It's really, really cool to see. Okay, I recognize that I'm incredibly biased, but I've been loving my time with Dynasty Warriors Origins. I wouldn't say it's a must-play for everybody, and I still think there's a lot of fundamental barriers to entry that will never go away for some people. But it's a truly stellar entry to the franchise that finally brings it up to speed with a lot of modern sensibility. And I think in removing those barriers, it makes it a lot easier for people to look at and go, okay, yeah, I kind of get the appeal, or just recognize that it's not for them. And I think that in itself is huge. It's also the first sequel in recent memory where I really did feel like it went out of its way to try to address all the problems that I had with the franchise up to that point. Playing the demo was just a barrage of, oh, they fixed that thing finally, or wow, they changed that. Holy crap, they got rid of that other thing. It was great. It was amazing. So if you're someone who has ever been on the fence about the Warriors games, or have been pushed away by some of those small things from earlier titles, I do believe that Dynasty Warriors Origins is the one that you want to try, because it feels like they made a game with you specifically in mind.